Hey, Jordan. How's it going?
What's up, Rob?
Not much. You know, it's work from home Friday here at Insurgents HQ.
Mm-hmm.
I'm relaxed. I'm in my element. I'm at home. Happy that the interns are obviously still at the office. It's for us. It's for the main guys. We're allowed to. We need to make sure some people are still. None of these millennials don't want to work anymore. You know, these Zoomers, lazy. So I'm happy that they're at the office making everything work, and I'm happy to be back here. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's exhausting going into the office. I'm glad the interns are getting that work ethic, but I think we've put in our time with all of these episodes for 4 years now that, we're working at home.
Yep. And it's a great opportunity for them to do that.
Yeah. Commute builds character.
Exactly.
You know what I've been doing though, Rob?
What's that?
For the first time ever in my life, I'm watching The Sopranos.
Ooh, nice. No, it's funny. You mentioned that to me earlier, and I've been doing the same thing. I've watched some of The Sopranos. I remember I watched season 4 when that was going on, but I had never watched the early seasons as well. So I've been doing the same thing. I've been making my way through the first couple seasons as well. I'm on the beginning of season 3. How are you enjoying that?
Yeah. Oh, it's really good. There's always, I'm so late to TV shows. I'm just not a big TV show person. I'm more of a movie guy. And I just watched Breaking Bad, last year for the first time. Loved it. And I figured, now it's 2024. The show is 25 years old. Now's a good time to get into The Sopranos. So I'm almost done with season 2, and it's fucking great.
Yeah, I think I've been having an interesting time watching it as well, because similar with Breaking Bad, how Walt became this hero to people, and it's are we watching the same show? This guy's obviously a really bad person. I get that he's the protagonist and you can watch it on that level, but you shouldn't be idolizing this person or making excuses for them. And I've noticed the same thing a little bit with Tony Soprano as well, who's obviously a really compelling character, amazing performance by James Gandolfini, but horrible person, and the idea that he ended up he has people and fans of the show that are yeah, Tony Soprano, all right. When he's always doing this really terrible shit, I think that's kind of interesting, the way that kind of anti-hero trope has become so prevalent in our media, and how people seem to be taking away a lot of the wrong lessons from that.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. It just seems like there's this pattern where people will just say, oh, this is the protagonist, I like him or I like her. And they can't think beyond just, oh, this is the main character. There's no recognition of their behavior being bad or inherently bad and objectively bad. In both, they're monsters. Tony is framed, especially early, as more of a family man than Walt. Walt pretty quickly turns into just a vile, terrible guy. I think maybe because Tony is bad from the start, but in his weird way, quote, cares about his family more, despite openly cheating on his wife that she knows about, being a pretty absent and shitty father, self-interested,
racist as well,
and other, and just all around bad guy. This person is cool. He makes a lot of money. He's a boss. I like him. Just weird. I like when shows do that, but I'm also not the type of person to be this guy rocks. It's just such a weird consumption habit that I don't get.
Yeah, no, it's really strange. But it's funny that we're both doing that. I feel like I've had this gap in my kind of pop cultural knowledge over the last couple of years by not ever having seen that entire thing. So I have really been enjoying just watching it from the start.
Yeah, it's good.
Good. Well, we got a huge episode today. There's an absolutely explosive story going on right now with the New York Times. Their promotion of this narrative about systemic, intentional campaigns of rape and sexual assault and sexual violence, and that was used as part of the October 7th attacks. This narrative has been going on since October 7th, but this really crystallized in this New York Times piece, which came out, I believe, at the end of December, called Screams Without Words. And there's been a massive scandal over the last couple of weeks as that's been exposed as being the entire piece has fallen apart. It's being exposed as incredibly fraudulent. The main author of this piece had zero journalistic experience. It's all relying on this secondhand information from these extremely unreliable sources. Not since Judith Miller and the weapons of mass destruction type stuff, I think has New York Times faced a kind of like a crisis like this or a scandal like this. And it is a scandal because this has been used to launder and justify this Israeli genocidal mass murder campaign going on in Gaza right now. So it's a huge story. It's a huge scandal. And we talked to today Daniel Boguslaw of The Intercept, who co-authored a piece with Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm breaking this down, and he was able to come onto the show to speak to us about it. What did you make of that?
Yeah, that was a really good conversation. The Intercept story was really fascinating, and just through every step of this process that the New York Times undertook for this story, there were all of these red flags, like, hey, there's nothing really here, and they just charged on anyway, which is just a total abdication of journalistic ethics and standards. It's really remarkable. Before we get to that, earlier this week, I talked to Joshua P. Hill about a variety of different things. Taylor Lorenz's interview with Libs of TikTok, Next Benedict, Biden's comments on why he's a Zionist and how no Jews anywhere in the world are safe if Israel doesn't exist. And Aaron Bushnell's extreme act of protest. It was a really good, robust conversation. You can get that if you go to insurgentspod.com. Just $5 a month. You get that episode and every other premium episode we've ever done. You get an extra episode every week. And we really thank you for those of you that subscribe.
Yeah. I was sorry to miss out on that one. I was just on my way back to a little trip I took to Virginia. I was seeing the beautiful sights of Virginia, Quantico, Langley. Pretty much just those two places were the main places that I was visiting, but it was really fantastic. I enjoyed it. I was sorry I missed that because there was a lot of stuff that I did want to talk about that. But I thought it was a really great interview, a really great episode. So I hope people check that out as well.
And I think people will understand if you're absent, you have to meet with investors. So
exactly,
it's just part of
the advisory board.
Business.
We get the talking points. This is people aren't interested in this. This is like how the sausage gets made stuff. It's behind the scenes. It's inside baseball. It's boring. We don't need to get into it, but it's just part of having a political podcast. It's just this kind of stuff you have to do. So that's all.
Yep. Everyone does it.
Let's get to our conversation with Daniel Boguslaw of The Intercept. What do you think about that?
Let's do it.
Let's get into it. And Daniel Boguslaw will be joining the show right after this.
Now we're joined by Dan Boguslaw. Dan, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a slow news week for you.
Yeah.
Is it cold in DC?
That's a good question.
Gotta go outside? All right.
I'll have to get back to you.
In Montreal, it was like a super warm, like spring day, Thursday, and then, Wednesday, super warm, and then Thursday, like 30 degrees colder, absolutely freezing cold, like the very next day. It was really jarring and didn't feel good at all.
Yeah. Things are not going well for the weather.
So here's the question that I have. Do we try and recreate the banter we were just doing prior to turning on the record button. That never seems to work out. We had a good little riff going before. And do we try and get back into that? That's always really tricky.
I'm just going to say, look, if you're a listener, if you're a nicotine user, if you're a leftist, check out my Substack, Trigger Discipline, where I investigate Zyn, looking into the single union factory in Kentucky that manufactures every tin of American Zyn. They hold the power to shut down trucking, to shut down call centers, to shut down any boring, horrible fucking job. These guys shut it down. And so I reported on how in Philip Morris's 10K, they're extremely concerned about their single Zyn factory. It could destroy their whole business model. The workers, this international union controls the means of production. Check it out.
This is international union. Wait, so within their filings, is there any acknowledgement or plans to diversify or establish a second factory? I'm so curious how they have this product, which is extremely popular from what I can tell, that they only manufacture at one place.
I think basically what happened was like there was like a Swedish company that owned this plant, and then like Philip Morris has been investing in like vape and like smokeless tobacco products. So they bought this one plant, and then like somehow Zyn just like became a meme and took off, and like it's like a huge plant. Like I think it's like 500 workers, which is big, and the revenue is just like out of control. And I think they probably will expand, but I think it's moving so fast that that they haven't been able to recalibrate.
Yeah, they have a big fan in Tucker Carlson. I keep getting this video on Instagram.
Oh yeah, I texted Tucker Carlson for his perspective, and he didn't want to comment.
Unfortunate. He like pretty publicly quit nicotine. He was a big Nicorette user up until 2019. He tried to quit in spring of 2019. The only reason I know this is because that's when I was doing the advertiser boycott campaign. So I was watching Tucker every night, and he would talk about it. But he had been a smokeless tobacco and nicotine user for like decades. So I guess he's back. I guess he's back on the Zyn because I see this video on Instagram all the time of people delivering him the world's largest tin of Zyn. Have you seen this?
Yes. It's a good video. Yeah.
I saw him like hanging out with some like Zoomers, some like weird Zoomer podcasters,
the Nelk
whatever.
Boys,
gave it to
full
him.
send.
Okay, I don't know about the Nelk Boys. I guess I'm not quite hip enough for that.
Yeah,
that's good that he's being kind of promoted to that generation, I guess, as like a cool guy.
Yeah. It's like kind of the Barstool, Tucker Carlson, Nelk crowd. Like, I mean, that Nelk Boys enterprise did a sit down with, I think, Trump a year or two ago.
Nelk Boys? I've never heard of this.
Yeah, the Full Send podcast.
Weird. Could I try something I've been workshopping really quick here?
You got like a Type 15 or what?
Yeah, this is like just a little something that could be a good transition.
Yeah.
This is Jerry Seinfeld responding to the events of October the 7th. The other day, I got asked to condemn Hamas. I thought they were asking me to condemn hummus. What's next? Guacamole? Come on!
Oh, that would fucking kill in 97.
You think people would like that?
That I think they did. Yeah.
I think you should pitch that to him.
Just send him your packet, and it's just that.
A little side project I've been cultivating.
Anyway, the most important thing about this Zyn stuff is that it's totally normal and healthy, and it's good to do, just like Diet Coke. It's good. It's a wonderful invention. It's like 99% water. You get some caffeine in there. Yep. Nothing wrong with it.
People love it. You take out a slimy wad from your mouth, stick it on a wall or some other surface near you.
Yeah, who doesn't love that? And now I'm really just reusing jokes from the banter prior to joining. So, but I wanted to get my shit in, so what we got to do.
One thing I wanted to talk about briefly before we got into the story that Dan, or the stories that Dan worked on this week that I think are very important. The reaction to the outcome in Michigan earlier this week for this Vote Uncommitted campaign. They received over 100,000 uncommitted votes in the primary. And the way that is being spun by liberals, Biden loyalists, the Biden team is, well, you're only helping Trump. And there's one kid, and not to assign political power to a Zoomer TikToker who just loves the Democrats, but I saw one kid even go so far as to say you're a terrorist if you voted uncommitted. I just want to take a second and think about how we have reached this point where the
Yes.
just get out and vote. Voting is so important, and we have to protect democracy. But if you put uncommitted on a primary ballot in a basically uncontested primary, you are a terrorist. That's something I think we can all align with, right?
No, yeah. There's no lies detected there. No, and it gets to a fundamental point, which is that the American people are the terrorists. If you don't fall in line behind one of the two major political parties, both of which are calling for unchecked war and bloodshed, then you are a terrorist. The blood of American civilians is on your hands, and you should be put in jail. And that's it.
Okay.
So I think that really gets to the heart of things.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple things that I was thinking about that. First of all, like you said, Jordan, like this is what liberals say is the way that you can participate in democracy. You don't protest, especially when it comes to Israel, Palestine. No, don't protest. Don't say certain words and slogans and sayings. It makes people upset and uncomfortable. Don't boycott. But what you can do is vote. You can vote for, and like, listen, we have one party that supports genocide and one party that supports genocide even more. So you can vote for the less bad option. But even when people organize around these like democratic institutions, in this campaign that came together really quickly over like a span of like 2 weeks, and they say like, no, that's still bad. That still helps Trump. All you can do is just vote for the Democratic Party. That's the one thing that you can do. But I also thought it funny seeing these like kind of this spin coming from people that are connected to the sort of Democratic Party establishment, kind of bragging, almost like we easily defeated uncommitted in Michigan after like 100,000 people were organized to come out and send this message to the Democratic Party in a really short time frame. And then the incumbent sitting president's like, we easily defeated the fact that like people were coming to show up in this useless primary to vote for nobody rather than vote for us. And they're trying to spin that like it's this like cool accomplishment that they did. I thought that was very funny as well.
And meanwhile, I think it was Washington, like one of the biggest unions came out and endorsed uncommitted.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely has momentum. And I think the other part of the narrative is like this is a hyper dense Arab American population, in Michigan, and so that it's also not representative of a serious threat. And it's like no, actually a lot of people watched this closely and saw that a campaign like this could be organized, and it seems like it's being replicated effectively in other states.
Yeah, and what people are looking at, it's only 100,000, and Biden got. What's 500, 600,000 votes? Like, I mean, this is a state with a population of 10 million, and the primary turnout is already much lower than general election turnout. So, if you were to apply that same ratio to, general election turnout, that's really troubling. And it's not that they'll vote for Trump; it's that those people might just not show up, or many of them might not even show up at all. It's a problem of turnout, not that they're supporting Trump. The response should be, okay, these people are in our base. They are registered as Democrats. How do we win them over? It's not we ignore them and then risk them sitting out. It's how do we incentivize them to show up? And this is a problem that Democrats never seem to respond to. It's, well, we're just going to change nothing and they'll figure it out by November. You can't bank on that. It didn't work in 2016. It's a core element of politics. How do you meet people where they're at, address their needs, speak to their needs, and give them something or some reason to show up? And it's just like a sense of entitlement, self-righteousness, that they are unwilling to do that when these people are very clearly in their base and often a key to victory.
Yeah, I also was really struck this week. There was, they started doing air airdrops of aid into Gaza, and it just opens up this whole realization of like, the U.S. has provided targeting support, they've provided intelligence support to the Israelis, they've provided all these resources, and there's been this constant debate about, oh, we can't get trucks through the border, blah, blah, blah. And like, then all of a sudden it reaches a certain point and a switch goes off and these airdrops start happening. And then you're like, well, why couldn't this have been going on all, the whole time? It's certainly, whatever the State Department says about, airspace or, difficulties in collaboration, we know from the reporting of my colleagues and others that there is no problem with collaboration. And so I think, it's also just a question of like, they're not even doing the bare minimum. They're not even trying to play both sides and meet pro-Israel and pro-Palestine people in the middle at all. Like the notion of airdropping in food was an afterthought. It wasn't even written into one of the options apparently early on in this conflict. So I think that further throws gas on the fire.
Yeah, and I mean, instead you have instead of what you're describing, you have Joe Biden sucking down an ice cream, just being like, "Yeah, maybe we're gonna get a ceasefire by Monday, Jack," or whatever. And that's like the most that he says about it, which I found exceptionally grotesque at any time. But it was the day after a United States Air Force serviceman burned himself alive in protest of his own government's responsibility and complicity in this genocide in Gaza. And the contrast between Aaron Bushnell and what he did with Biden the next day, just nonchalantly having a sweet little tasty treat and just making up some bullshit about a possible ceasefire coming, which obviously never materialized. And I think that's what they would say is trying to meet in the middle. Like, yeah, after tens of thousands of people have been murdered, then we'll maybe talk about a brief pause in the killing, which is going to, of course, resume shortly afterwards. And that's the compromise. That's the like speaking to trying to appease both sides that they would indicate. Like it's just absolutely gross.
Also, we saw this week, Biden and Trump went down to the border for basically photo ops and to talk about immigration. And Biden invited former President Trump to work together on a border bill while challenging congressional Republicans to show a little spine. And it's these things together. It's the repudiating uncommitted voters. It's nonchalantly and lazily suggesting maybe there will be a ceasefire as we see atrocity after atrocity, and then yet again asking Republicans for a harsh border bill. Like all of these things together are going to turn people off. It's going to discourage turnout, and it just seems like they're walking into a repeat of 2016 where people are just fed up with Democratic leadership, a Democratic administration. And it's not that they want Trump, and they're fully aware of the risks and the dangers and the consequences. It's just that they are so fed up with this party. They're so fed up with the people in control and the way that these people don't respond to the crises that Trump exacerbates. It's just... I can't imagine. I just can't wrap my head around the fact that they refuse to do anything about this.
Yeah, and to me, it's just we go back to the whole Michigan thing. It's the complete inability to even think about changing course at all. Like, in the contempt that they have for people that try to use these kind of democratic institutions to try and put pressure on their elected officials, which is exactly what these institutions are supposed to do. And the total unwillingness to say, like, maybe we should reconsider this. Like, maybe we should reconsider our unequivocal support for this series of the most horrendous crimes that we could possibly imagine. Perhaps that's contributing to some kind of alienation. Perhaps that's hurting us in our base of people that we need to rely on in these states. And like, there's just zero effort to do that at all. Like, just even genuinely from like a cynical, like electoral standpoint, it's crazy to me. Zero effort whatsoever to engage with the arguments that these groups are making. Zero effort at all to change their course or to change their strategy at all. Instead, these people are just treated with total contempt, and they just get talked about like they're petulant babies. Oh, you're just voting on this one issue, like it's this minor thing with like the mass murder of tens of thousands of little kids. it's amazing to me. And yeah, it's just, I find it repeatedly just totally stunning the way that there's just no effort whatsoever to change their strategy at all.
Yeah, I just think that, you know, it is unfortunate that there's a failure to recognize the reality that we survived 4 years of Trump. That even after he won the presidency, stacked the Supreme Court, tried to gut the federal government as deep to the bone as he could, you know, the crippled and decrepit institutions of democracy prevailed. And I think that there is a cognitive dissonance on the left where people think that the way to preserve democracy is by ceding to the demands of a party, the Democratic Party, that is completely controlled by the Israel lobby and corporate interests. And so there's a total breakdown in people being able to recognizing that standing up for your beliefs is what democracy is, and that it is not cowering in fear that if you do that, democracy will crumble. It's a completely counterintuitive retreat from the ideals that these liberals are screaming about protecting.
Did you, by chance, see that clip of Nina Turner on election night on CNN on that panel talking about the results? She was providing context to this. You know, this is why they're upset, and we need to think about how we talked about people like Representative Rashida Tlaib in Michigan when this conflict broke out, and her emotions, her reaction, her comments. She was called abhorrent. I think she was censured at one point. And as she was trying to provide that context, not just Anderson Cooper, who was like the host and the moderator of that hour, other panelists were jumping down her throat. She was the only person who was on that panel that could reasonably speak to Palestinian interests. And it was like David Axelrod, a former Trump administration official, Caitlin Collins, and then Bakari Sellers, who has...
Well, Axelrod's an Obama guy.
Yeah. But Bakari Sellers is has long-standing ties to AIPAC, and he also runs a PAC, a space PAC, that received like $1 million at least from some Republican mega donor who also helps fund AIPAC. And he's like jumping in to be like, well, they're suffering on both sides. And it's like, look, man, that's not why people are voting this way. And just like to compare the two and to try to equivocate was just totally disingenuous. But at one point, Anderson Cooper's like, we don't need a lecture. It's like, you're talking, like you're trying to talk about 100,000 people in this state who are upset, so upset that they're willing to participate in this organized campaign on primary day. And you don't even want to have a discussion about why they're doing that. What is the root cause here? It was just really spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, I think also I want to say people are suffering on both sides. And in the same way that there's an insane, perverse, incoherent logic with the liberal mainstream in the United States arguing against advocacy for beliefs that go against the party line, it's also critical to realize that the interests of the Israel lobby fundamentally destabilize Israel's society and security, and not only the physical security, but the social fabric of Israel, and that this war is against the interests of the Israeli population.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important point. You know, I've spoken on this show before about reporting in Israel and my family connections there, and I think it's an important point to also make that this is bad for everyone and goes against everyone's interests and is ludicrous. It's a ludicrous line to take, saying that people are suffering on both sides and that's why the violence should continue.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess just the one counterpoint that I would make to that is that there is a massive discrepancy in who's been suffering, especially over the last 5 months, but yes, overall as well in the conflict. And the reality is as well, even though I agree with what you're saying, that it does have this destabilizing effect. It does make Israel less secure. It does make Israeli people less safe. But there's also widespread support for this war among the Israeli population. There's been repeated polling on this that shows like a vast majority of people in Israel do actually support the ongoing conflict, and many want it to escalate even more. So that's probably something we need to keep in mind.
No,
also.
absolutely. And I think I've spoken previously just about how indoctrinated the entire, civilian population is. And I mean, civilian population is somewhat of a misnomer given the fact that, mandatory conscription. But one other point I would just add is it also dramatically impacts American and American national security as well. I mean, I don't think that this is one thing I've hungered for more reporting on. I do not think that the full impact of the wave of radicalization that is going to develop from this conflict has been analyzed or can even be analyzed at this point. I mean, we are living through a scale of violence that is being recorded and distributed on the internet that I don't think has really ever happened before. And the impact that will have on mass radicalization is going to be dramatic. And I don't think anybody has touched on that really.
Yeah. We haven't even begun to experience the ultimate fallout and blowback from what we've been supporting there in both the United States and Canada, which it's going to be being felt for decades, though, certainly. Dan, we should really talk about this story in the Intercept Between the Hammer and the Anvil, which you co-published along with Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm, which is confirmed what I think there had already been prior reporting on this and what a lot of people already believed about specifically the New York Times article that came out December 28th, Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th. We talked about this around that time when that piece came out. I thought it was this whole narrative about Hamas using the systemic, intentional, like roving Arab rape gangs kind of narrative or trope that was promoted, which really picked up steam shortly after that first ceasefire ended. And there was that brief ceasefire. There was some hostages that were exchanged. There was a possibility that it might extend into the future. And then, of course, Israel begins bombing Gaza again. The violence resumes. And while there's kind of outrage about that, there's this narrative that gets promoted by all these different sources about these Hamas rape gangs of October 7th. And that was what this piece focused on. So I would just we'd like to hear from your perspective working on this story where you have contributed to this reporting that has turned into a huge scandal, I think, with the New York Times about this story and about how flimsy it is and who was writing it and reporting it. Do you just want to talk a little bit about your perspective of how this piece came together and what your understanding is of this New York Times story?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this story is an attempt to explain the various power networks that shape news and trying to highlight the inconsistencies in the editorial process for foreign reporting that exist between places like Israel and places like Ukraine or really anywhere else in the world. And, I think it's one thing to point out hypocrisy or point out, egregiously hedged headlines. But what we've tried to show over the course of our reporting with the New York Times and other media outlets is the fundamental editorial structures, the leadership decisions, the way in which certain journalists are prioritized over others, despite track records of error or biased reporting. And, I think the sort of exegesis of this story really tries to get at that by showing step by step, how were these reporters brought together? What did their reporting process look like? And how does that compare to other reports and other, other standard reporting procedures that were not followed. I think one of the biggest points of contention is, who is viewed as a legitimate source. A lot of the sourcing in that piece came from Zaka, these ultra orthodox first responders who made decisive claims as though they were experts on sexual violence. And when you drill down and actually look at both their statements and the history of misleading statements that some of the members of this organization have made in the past, you see that basically what they say is a lot of their conclusions are vibes based. They basically say, it's not about the facts. It's about the feeling that we got, exhuming these corpses and, our intuition as first responders. And, time and time again, the Israeli government has failed to produce forensic evidence substantiating these claims. And that was a trend that came up over and over again in the course of this reporting. On other news organizations, is when you drill down, when you look at the base level of claims that have been repeated and compiled into reports and packaged together in a way to add legitimacy, you find that at the fundamental level, there's no one who can give hard first person confirmation of almost any of these claims.
That's what was, I wouldn't say surprising, but just, I guess, frustrating as I read it. At multiple opportunities, the reporter that you kind of follow in this piece, Anat Schwartz, someone who didn't really have a lot of journalism background or no real journalism background.
Yeah.
At multiple
opportunities, just go right to the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah, at multiple points in the course of her reporting, she's basically presented and doesn't realize it with this thought, like, nothing is being confirmed here. There are no sources. There's no evidence. There's nothing that would validate these claims, especially of mass, systemic, and organized, attacks like this. And still, she presses on, and it was the way you detail this story. It's then she saw somebody on TV or saw most of the time these people had affiliations with that organization or had positions in the IDF, and they are repeating these claims. They're talking about these things happening, and she's like, "Well, okay, clearly it must be happening. It can't just be that this didn't happen. This didn't exist. Maybe there were isolated incidents, which happens in war. I mean, you acknowledge that it could have happened. It could have been someone who left Gaza and went into a kibbutz and did it. But the idea that operatives were doing this in an organized manner just was not proven. And there's a narrative that has been employed many times before, including recently in Libya. This exact narrative was promoted that Gaddafi's forces were taking Viagra and using sexual violence as a weapon in this exact way to justify intervention and to justify this kind of violence. Yeah. There was an editorial meeting you talk about where they gathered Middle East reporters from the staff to kind of try to poke holes, to make their coverage more thorough and fortify it. And they're asking explicitly, like, where's the evidence? And they basically admit, like, okay, where there isn't any. But then the other reporter, oh God, his name is escaping me, Gettleman. Jeffrey Gettleman acknowledges at some point, like, we don't really need evidence for this. We don't really need proof for this. Like, I can't imagine any other circumstance in which the New York Times, with a prestige, first, A1 story, would just say, well, we don't really need any proof for this kind of a story.
Well, there's an interesting video of Gettleman that was circulating where he was invited to speak at like a Columbia has a program or some Columbia affiliated program around sexual violence. And I think he's being interviewed by Cheryl
Bill Sandberg.
Is it Sandberg?
Yeah,
Yeah.
lean in.
And 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 he basically says, I don't like to use the term evidence because that's a legal forensic term. My job is to just kind of collect vibes and shape them and massage them and then put them out. And it's a shocking admission. I mean, it's just it. I have to say that this whole time reporting all of this, it is so bizarre to hear some of these statements. It makes you feel like you're going crazy, because that is not what reporting is. In fact, reporting is about collecting evidence, and it's about making it airtight. And if you don't have it airtight, then it's about making that extremely clear, because that is a fact in and of itself, that the facts are eluding you. And that's okay. But then you have to write that and say that. And that's newsworthy. That's relevant. That's something that people can be informed about. That's something is difficult to report on or impossible to report on. But to say that your job isn't about reporting facts and using evidence is ludicrous. And I think really betrays something fundamental about his perspective on reporting, that he's some sort of maestro conducting, a song to his own liking instead of a job, which is collecting information and relaying it.
Yeah, and I think it really speaks to a common phenomena that we see when it comes to our media here in the West and Israel, which is that we have these powerful media institutions that just seem to be inclined to just take everything Israel says, every claim that they make at face value, and just treat it as the gospel truth and kind of work backwards from there. And often this is done with the timing to disrupt certain other narratives. Like the most recent example that I can think of this was after the International Court of Justice ruling, which ruled that Israel could plausibly be accused of committing genocide and ordered the violence to stop, which was a major story. And then immediately after, almost the day after, there's this narrative that gets promoted in our media about UNRWA members participating in October 7th. And then rather than talk about the ICJ ruling, rather than investigating that claim, that gets repeated just as a fact by our media, by our political establishment. And we respond by cutting funding to this vital humanitarian organization at a time when people in Gaza are starving. And this seems to be the same kind of a case. It was, like I said, there was also a specific narrative tied to this when this initial ceasefire ended, was when this really started to be promoted. And it seems like from your story, like you're mentioning, it's not just about the authors of the piece. I think there's all kinds of things we can dig into about these people and what their motivations and their backgrounds are. But it really seems like this came from the top down. When this claim got made, go and get us a story about this, find evidence for this, that this is true, so we can put it in our newspaper. And like Jordan was describing, it's like this process of her kind of desperately doing whatever she can to try and find something that can pass for evidence that they can turn into a major story, which then promotes this narrative, which justifies this ongoing genocidal mass murder campaign. Like it's incredibly sick the way that you see this process just happening over and over again.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there was a way to write this article about, there probably is some difficulty with forensic evidence with the rapid burials, but this article could have been an opportunity to do a straight piece of reporting, to talk about the still horrendous violence that happened on October 7th, and to talk to people and give both sides, and also add some quotes about people saying that there's been a failure to provide forensic evidence, and to bolster the feeling of trust in the news organization, and to say, okay, thank you for presenting, the struggle and the difficulty and the confusion of this event. That's what I think a newspaper's job is to do the best job that they can and cop to the challenges where the ability to provide the necessary evidence for claims stops, and to flag that for readers. And the idea that the piece couldn't have run without this that, is ludicrous. There's a completely different piece that someone assigned for this project could have come up with. So it shows that at every step of the process, you had a reporter and you had editors and you had leadership just giving it the green light over and over and over again.
I just have to mention something about the content of this article as well, because like this barely even qualifies as being like a journalistic enterprise here. Like this piece, it's front loaded with about 4 or 5 paragraphs of the most graphic, horrifying descriptions of sexual violence that you could possibly imagine. Just absolutely horrific, sick stuff. Front loaded, like I'm with the understanding that I think most people, that's going to be their takeaway. They read that and it just becomes like it's horrible and it's traumatizing. And then later, the rest of the piece is spent with this very kind of flimsy process of trying to explain how they're describing these kinds of stories. And it's like it's so insidious and manipulative the way that this piece was written. And the idea that this is like a piece of journalism is I think incredibly debatable just on that level. Like it's not really what real journalism is. It's purely like shock value, like almost like a written version of like a snuff film, basically, just designed to disgust people and designed to ensure that people continue to go along with this horrific campaign of violence that we've seen since that time. It's just, I was really taken aback by that and how completely outrageous that was and how horrifying some of these descriptions were, which, as we know now, weren't actually based in any kind of real evidence whatsoever.
Yeah, and I also just think it's a shame because, like, perhaps an unpopular opinion at this moment, but like there are extremely serious, committed, brilliant reporters and editors at the New York Times. Like there are people who like are bureau chiefs or are correspondents or are like people who are not just like sitting in an office, in Midtown, but people who've spent their whole lives learning about a region or a topic and are really good and knowledgeable and also conform to high journalistic standards. And it's just a shame that just with the fear that exists in our ecosystem right now, that those people consistently over decades have been pummeled by the desire of newsroom leadership to insulate themselves from external critique. And I think I have a lot of respect for journalists who put in the work and try to learn and try to be subject matter experts and try to actually show people what's going on with the belief that people are intelligent and they can make their own conclusions and that they don't have to, that's not their job to shape things because, people can reach their own conclusions and that's the right way to do things. So I also just think it's a shame that it delegitimizes the work of those people who are serious about it.
The context about who this reporter is, or the person who wrote this story is, and how this story came to light and how it was flagged for people as worth looking into the backstory, I think is interesting. An anonymous Twitter account noticed that she liked a tweet saying that Israel needed to turn the Gaza Strip into a slaughterhouse and, quote, violate any norm on the way to victory. Those in front of us are human animals who do not hesitate to violate minimal rules. And as we've had, I think all of us have had friends who have worked at the Times or know people who've worked at the Times. They have a very strict social media policy, and they come down hard if you engage with any content that could even be seen as just somewhat partisan. And the fact that this person,
even if you attended a pro-Palestine rally once in college, that's enough to keep you out a lot of these mainstream journalism circles.
For sure. And I'm just so curious, how this person got this prominent position or this prominent task or assignment with that kind of a history. I guess they weren't really exercising due diligence on who this person was. Again, it's just so confusing that she didn't have any real reporting experience and despite the past online engagement, despite the lack of experience, and despite the lack of proof, they just turn a blind eye to all of it. And it reflects a problem throughout our media that they're intentionally, in some cases, maybe inadvertently, driving a narrative that ultimately is dehumanizing for people in Gaza, for Palestinians. And they're treating it as kind of like a spectator sport, and they're talking about the conflict in abstract or in passive language. And a good example of that this week was CNN framing the massacre of people in Gaza who were trying to obtain aid as a chaotic incident. And that led to Christiane Amanpour and other CNN staffers speaking out and asking questions and raising concerns internally. Dan, you have a new story about what's happening at CNN on that front. Could you update us on that?
Yeah. So actually, I obtained a leaked record of an internal CNN meeting from about 2 weeks ago, which took place at the London bureau with a sort of three-member panel comprised of CNN executives. And this was kind of supposed to be a sort of town hall about editorial vision and shifting priorities of the various arms of the CNN enterprise, but it quickly devolved into a interrogation of the executives over what staffers described as myriad failures to adequately cover the war, and the people asking questions about protocols and the decision to host incendiary guests, making incendiary comments, like the Israeli defense minister. They also raised concerns about the people on the ground and the way that the people on the ground were covering this. What types of access they were getting, and whether there should be reports without certain forms of access. And then, the most high-profile person to speak was Christiane Amanpour, the chief international correspondent, who basically raised similar concerns that staffers had raised with me a month ago over the protocol which CNN has in place to run every story concerning Israel or Gaza through a team of editors known as the Jerusalem Secondize, which is largely comprised of Jerusalem-based editors, to basically make sure that the language and framing and context of the piece is not subject to critique from pro-Israel factions. And so to have the chief international correspondent, who's an extremely well-respected journalist who's covered conflicts in the Gulf War, in Bosnia, say that this was, that there was a double standard here, really showed that, this is not the grumbling of a few low-level staffers. This is being felt and recognized at the highest levels of the organization. And I've reported on it. The Guardian did a massive long story about discontent inside CNN. And now you have one of the most famous public-facing people in the organization, also coming out and saying it. And it's unclear if there's a mechanism of public pressure to make it change. I thought that maybe there was, but that seems more and more dubious, maybe. But again, it shows that there's a disconnect between large swaths of the newsroom that are actually generating the work and the people at the top overseeing it and trying to sculpt the editorial reputation of the institution.
I think one of the things that a lot of mainstream journalists in our society kind of talk to us about is like this need to have like non-biased reporting, to present both sides of an issue, to make sure that there's no kind of conflict of interests or anything like this. But like we talked about, I think that's one of the amazing things we've seen, not just with this story, but like there's a number of other examples of like, not only, so if you're a reporter and you go to a pro-Palestine protest in college and then that gets found out, you can lose your position because you're biased and you can't talk about Palestine because you're obviously some kind of like extremist activist or something. where the ability to work with people that have direct connections with the IDF and putting these people in high positions in our mainstream media establishment is just, and having those people be the arbiters of like and editors for stories about Israel Palestine, and this is just presented without ever describing these kinds of like conflicts. Whether we talk about the co-writer of this piece,
Anat.
Whether you're talking about her or even people like Jeffrey Goldberg with The Atlantic, who is like the editor of a major American magazine, has this history of working with the IDF, and like this is just part of our media establishment, and it's never really discussed, or this kind of possible bias or conflict of interest is never really talked about. Like, it's really amazing how this is presented as just being as part of our journalistic enterprises. Like, if we had people in that were like Chinese expatriates that used to be part of the Chinese Communist Party or the PRC, editing major American or Canadian newspapers or magazines, and then writing pro-China articles in the magazine, or with Russia or Iran or Venezuela or whatever other country that you want to pick, no one would be okay with that or consider that acceptable or consider that just to be like a normal, like non-biased journalist. But we can have people like with these literal ties to the Israeli government or even like the IDF or Israeli intelligence working in our media and promoting stories, just basically becoming stenographers for the Israeli government. And this process happens and no one ever really talks about it. I think it's truly amazing to me that this has been allowed to continue.
Yeah, it's wild.
Dan, we want to thank you for your time. Where can people follow you, find your reporting on the International Union and more of your work?
Yeah, check me out on Substack at Trigger Discipline and also at theintercept.com, where you can find under my name tag all the media reporting. I've largely been doing just media reporting for the past 3 months. You can find it all there. Can
I just make one more point as well before we sign off here? Because I think this is an interesting capper to this story. Because you talked about Zaka and the role that Zaka played in providing some of the secondhand reporting that ended up getting passed for evidence in this piece. And we've talked about how problematic that is, and how, like, as an organization, they're not really credible. And I think something that I learned the other day that I was absolutely amazed by was that Zaka a couple years ago started a advisory board in New York City, and that on the board of Zaka in New York is this man, Stuart Seldowitz, who you might remember a few months ago was literally arrested for harassing a Egyptian halal cart street vendor and going on these deranged racist rants about Palestinians and saying that, like, Palestinian children, it wasn't enough, whatever 5,000 children wasn't enough at that time. And like, these are the people that are in these institutions. Not only wasn't as the advisor to Obama, and he's a part of the like American national security kind of establishment, he's also sitting on the boards of these organizations, which are then sharing information that gets laundered by the media and used to promote and defend and justify just the absolute worst, most depraved violence. I think it's pretty incredible when I learned this, and you see how the way this whole process works. It's just really sick. But I was just amazed to see Stuart Seldowitz on the board, sits on the board of Zaka.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's really crazy. There's been so much crazy shit. I saw that and laughed, and then it got wiped from my hard drive.
It's been a lot. Yeah. Dan, thanks for joining the show. I appreciate the work that you do, and I appreciate you can come on and talk to us about this story.
Thanks for having me, guys.